Hello, and welcome back to the podcast where you are invited for lighthearted conversations about things that matter as you seek to live your most meaningful, beautiful, and joyful life. I'm your host, Dr. Edie Wadsworth, and I hope you enjoy your stay here at the House of Joy. Hey, everybody. I am so happy today. I have my dear friend of probably, 100 years.
Yeah.
One of my literal favorite people that I met on the internet. I'm so excited to have you here, Ms. Melanie Shankle.
Edie, I'm so happy to be with you. I woke up this morning and I was like, I get to talk to Edie today. It was the best day.
I was feeling exactly the same way. Except this book has undone me in the best way. So I am very excited to have you here. I said this to you before I started recording, but I want to say this publicly. I am so proud of you. This book, game-changing, generational, curse-breaking, glass ceiling shattering. It's so good. I think I've read all of your books.
Thank you.
And this is the one I've personally been waiting on because I knew there was a story there, and it makes me really emotional because I know what it's like to write a book like this. And I just want you to know, I'm so proud of you. You're so courageous.
Thank
the
you.
way you handled the story that you wrote is such a blessing to us all. And I just can't wait to dive in. I can't wait until all of our community and listeners get to know you and love you and get the privilege of reading this book. So, author of newest book, soon to be out everywhere, Here Be Dragons. Tell us about this title.
Yeah.
As a lover of the hero's journey, I'm like, you're speaking to my heart just in the title. So tell us about it.
Well, okay. So the title came to me probably 5 years ago, and I read something, and I don't even remember where I read it, but I was on the internet, and you know how you go down a rabbit trail of things. And so I found this story. And so back in medieval times, before we had Apple Maps that told us exactly where we were going and how to get there, when ancient mariners would take off across the sea, they would have these maps. And so you would make these maps. And anytime there was an area where someone had either encountered danger or somebody hadn't explored there before, or it was new territory, they would mark it in Latin and they would say, "Here be dragons." And it was just a way of signaling of hey, there may be danger up ahead. There's something here. Pay attention.
Something lurking in these waters.
Something is lurking in these waters. And at the time, and I had no idea all the ways that was going to play out, but at the time I thought, man, isn't that like life, where you're just going along and there's always dragons? There's always something that we're going to have to fight, that we're going to have to face, that we're going to have to contend with if we're going to continue making our journey. Because the thing about dragons, and I think I say this in the book, is they have the power to destroy everything if you let them remain. Yeah. And so it's how do we fight our dragons? And so when I initially signed on to write this book, which this was the title that I pitched to the publisher and all that stuff. But at the time, I thought it was just going to be about my journey of becoming an empty nester, because our only child, Caroline, was going off to school. And I thought I would talk a little bit about kind of some of her experience with Mean Girls in high school. I did not know that it was really going to turn into a book about kind of healing from and overcoming the generational dysfunction that I had grown up with. That was a surprise. That was a dragon that God had waiting for me that I didn't know was coming.
Yeah. And as I read your book, we had a similar sort of coping mechanism for the dragons that we didn't want to face, which is ignore them, be better, be as good as you can, contort yourself into every possible scenario so that you can please the dragons. I think we had a similar way of coping with it, and it just in the long run doesn't work. And so I think this is just such a needed conversation. I first want to start though, because this is not your first rodeo, and this is I don't know, how many books have you written?
I think this is my sixth or seventh, sixth, I think. Sixth trade book, I think. Yeah. There's some devotionals and other stuff, but I think sixth book.
So, and I have been your friend, cheerleader, like in the background going, "Oh my gosh, you go girl. Like you are really one of my favorite writers. You're so funny." We've met in person several different times. I used to always come to San Antonio for Stevie's podiatry conferences, and we would meet up,
Yeah.
and then I had you come and speak at my conference, a few years ago. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a long-standing love affair with Melanie Shankle and her writing. But give
Same.
everybody a little bit of an intro that doesn't know you from the Big Mama blog back in 2008 when I found you.
Listen, Edie, we met at the dawn of
We
the
did.
internet. It was the dawn of the internet. But I started a blog in 2005, July
You were so
2005
far ahead
is
of
when I
me.
started.
Wow.
I was so well, and it all originated from, it was so funny because when I was pregnant with Caroline, she was born in August of 2003. And when I was pregnant with her, I found all these like mommy forums, like back then you didn't really even have
Right.
blogs. And then somebody linked to a blog that was about new motherhood. And I was like, oh, well, isn't that kind of cool? So I had started reading, like there weren't that many out there, but I started reading blogs. And then when Caroline was just about to turn 3, late one night at our desktop computer, I thought, I'm going to start a blog on blogspot.com and a free
Yes.
blog. And I'm not great at follow through. So I kind of thought, I'll do this for a month. This will be like something I'll do. But I called it Big Mama because at the time Caroline was calling me Big Mama. She was about to turn 3.
And
And
if
that's what
anybody
she
knows you, you're like
decided to.
literally not as big as a minute. But
But it was because I was telling her all the time, like, you're a big girl now. And so in her mind,
well,
she was
you're a
like,
big
oh,
mama.
you're a big mama. And so I didn't know it was going to stick. I just thought, oh, that's cute. So named it that and started writing on it. I wrote on it Monday through Friday for years. I mean, up until I think Caroline was almost 15. And it got to the point where it's like, it's hard to write about a teenager. But I mean, it was just a chronicle of our lives. But through that, I met you because that's when you were doing Life and Grace. Yep. And I immediately adored you. I loved everything about you. Just, I think it was Michael and Smith referred to you one time as the homecoming queen of the internet at that time. And that's how it felt, is you were just,
that's hilarious.
You were just bright and shiny, and your house was so beautiful, and you baked bread, and you did all the things before. It's almost like you were one of the original like real influencers. Like you baked bread and you decorated and you showed us how to do all these things. And then you wrote a book that I think when I read your book, I was like, oh wow. Like just because our stories have a similar thread in terms of what you're having to overcome in your past and your family. And when I read yours, it was so powerful and it was so good. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, someday I'll get to tell my story. I just can't tell it now.
And I remember,
but you paved the way.
I remember over the years, just times when we would have a chance to sit down and chat about life. I knew there was a story here, like, and I could tell that you weren't ready to really talk about it, certainly not ready to write about it. But I thought to myself, when Melanie Shankle is ready to write about this is going to be powerful. And that's exactly what I experienced. I felt so many emotions when I read it. In some ways, I think kids who come from this kind of dysfunction, this kind of trauma, there's something that like bonds you together. Like after I wrote my book, it came out in 2016. From then on, whenever I met people, there was no small talk. We went straight to the heart because you connect in such like a visceral, raw, like you can connect to that story so powerfully. And some of the incidences that you describe in the book felt so familiar in some of the worst ways to me. And it's interesting because you've been, and I can't wait to hear about it, you've been on quite a healing journey the past 2 years. And when I was going through, I started counseling. Well, I did a bunch of counseling like when I was younger for all the things that happened in my childhood, but I wasn't really ready, I don't think, to face it all. So when I went through counseling as I was writing my book, it just felt like peeling layer after layer, as you allude to, like, oh, there are more dragons lurking. Like, I thought I had healed from it.
Yeah.
And I love when you write about that, oh, I mean, now I'm grown up and I have a husband and I have my own child. So of course I'm past that. No, just because time
No.
passes, just because you
Yeah.
take on more adult roles, doesn't mean
Yep.
that you've really dealt with it. So I'm really curious, like, for you, at what point did you go, okay, now I'm ready. I'm ready to dig into this?
I think a lot of it for me was, and you said an interesting thing, and I think it's where so many of us land. It's where I landed for years. Is in my mind, I dreamed probably to the point that it was almost like an idol in my life of I'm going to have this marriage and this family, and it's going to be great, and I'm going to do better than what was done to me, and it's going to be amazing. The thing is if you're not doing the deep healing, it was like just putting a band-aid over like a big gaping wound, because like the insecurities still were there, and the fear was still there, and the anxiety was still there. And I think that almost didn't become apparent to me. Like, I think the irony is I started writing this book and thought, I'm ready to tell this story, and I can tell it from this perspective of that I'm totally healed. And writing this book put me into therapy for the first time in my adult life.
Yes.
It's like all of a sudden, because you're digging up stuff and you're thinking about things that you had buried. And Sophie, who's my podcast partner, she's in kind of my first editor. I always send everything to her first. And when she was reading the early copies, that were like the early draft, she was like, hey, your writing is beautiful, but you're telling this like you're writing a novel about World War II. Like, it's just this, here are some things that happened, and I'm going to tell you from this like 10,000 foot view. And she was like, you're going to need to talk about how it made you feel and what it did. And I was like, I don't really want to talk about that. Like, that's painful. Yeah. And so I will say that this is the first book that I've written where, I mean, so many times I just wrote it while just sobbing, because you're just bringing up all this stuff that was like, I don't really want to think about all this. But I think what it did is it allowed God to heal places in me that I didn't even know were still broken. Yeah. And places where I had just learned to manage or to, fit this. I was still trying to fit these certain molds because I had just become so accustomed to, I didn't even know what it was like to be able to advocate for myself or to say, here's how I feel about something, or here's my opinion on something. I've always been such a people pleaser, because my whole life mantra was like, let's just keep it down. Let's keep I'm going to make everybody happy with my own two hands. And I don't know if you know, but that doesn't really always work out so well for your emotional well-being.
It's not great coping mechanism. Yeah. And it's exactly what so many of us do, especially women, because I mean, I think that's actually the whole reason I ended up going to medical school. I'm like, if I'm smart enough, if I'm driven enough, if I achieve enough, it'll bring everybody together. It'll, cover over everything that's wrong. It will. And I just basically ran my own health into the ground, basically trying to be good enough, do enough, people please enough, contort myself enough that I feel like it would fix everything. And yeah, I think that sort of coming undone is how I felt. I'm like, and I don't know what the experience will be for you, but when my book came out that was as raw as yours is, I felt so relieved in some way. I'm like, oh, no more hiding, no more having to overachieve, no more pretending like I've got it all figured out or that it's perfect. But I also, because I had lived that way for so long, then I started to get this vulnerability hangover, like, oh yeah. Oh, now it's like out there. So has that set in for you? Like, have you felt like, oh gosh, like...
I mean, definitely a little bit. Like, I think the closer we get to the release date, I'm like, oh, this is really all going to be out there. And I'm really honest in the book. I mean, I'm really honest about my experience. I'm really honest about Caroline's experience, which, she gave me permission. I mean, I had to go to her and say, are you good with me telling this story? Yeah. And God bless her. She's such a truth teller, black and white. She was like, tell it all. I don't care. Like, if it helps anybody, I'm great with it. And so it does feel like, man, this is a lot to put out there in a different way than what I've done. But I think my hope is that people will see, number one, because I think you're an example. When I read your story, it's that you never know what somebody
Mm-mm.
has been through. You never know what somebody's walking through. You never know what somebody's dealing with, because I think especially now we see each other on Instagram and all these things, and you're
Well,
like,
they
well,
have
that
a
just
great
looks
life. Yeah.
lovely. Hey, that is perfect. I wish I had a perfect life like that, where everybody just got along and everything was great. And the truth is we all have our messes. We all have our things that we're dealing with. We all have our struggles. And this was one that for me, for years, I couldn't talk about publicly. So it was my thing that only the people closest to me knew that I had been through, that I had walked through, and what that looked like. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of but I also think, because there have been some, like, I guess, advanced reader copies that have gone out into the world, with pre-orders, some people have been able to read the first couple of chapters or whatever. And so far, like no other book, I feel like I've gotten so many messages already from people saying, oh my gosh, you put words to something that I didn't know how to put words to, or this was my story too, and nobody talks about this in church circles or Christian circles. And so, it's the balance of, I mean, I think God uses everything in our life for good. And so it's like, yes, I have this vulnerability hangover, but also if you're going to use this to help other women heal or be able to begin the healing journey or whatever,
Yes.
then
And
it's
for
worth
me,
it,
it was
you know?
like, yes. And for me, it was like the beginning of taking off all my masks. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have
Yeah.
to pretend. I don't have to carry this. It feels like you're carrying something so heavy that you're not meant to carry. You're meant to heal in the shared community of people who love you and support you. It's not something that you're supposed to, or I think intended to just carry, in your own heart for years and years. And it was such a freedom. It just took me a while to adjust to, like, oh, now I don't have to hide anymore, or I don't have to
Yeah.
pretend. And it's what's so powerful about that is that it just invites other people to the same freedom. And I'm sure
Yeah.
that's what your
Yeah.
readers are already experiencing, and it's so awesome when somebody's brave enough to go first. I remember I always loved memoirs because I think I was so fascinated,
Mhm.
like, I know my upbringing was a little crazy. Let me read about somebody else's.
Yeah.
So I've always, like,
Yes.
really been
Yeah.
drawn to memoirs, and, I remember reading some memoirs, like, early on and going, "Oh, some people, like, I'm not the only one." And it kind of
Yeah.
paves the
That's
way for
it.
other people to own their own story
Mhm.
and to be willing and brave enough to share, and you did it in
Yep.
such a beautiful way. Although, let me just tell you that this quote that you have in the front of it by Anne Anne Lamott, I'm like,
Anne Lamott.
I know this book's gonna be good because when you start with this quote, it says, "You own everything that happened to you. Tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better."
Listen, I read that years ago by Anne Lamott. I've almost wanted to have it framed and hang it in
Yeah.
my house, because I'm like, it's the truth. I mean, they're your stories, and at some point, you have the right to tell your
Yeah.
story. And I always knew that there wouldn't, I mean, I wasn't in a rush to tell it. And here's the other thing: I did not want to tell it, and I never wanted to process this. I always wanted to process this from a place of
Healing.
healing and
Yeah.
redemption and forgiveness, and to let go of the bitterness. Like none of this is out of bitterness. It's about health, about being whole and healthy. It's about trying to create something better than what I came
Yes.
from. And I think you can only do that because I always knew if I do any of this with bitterness or unforgiveness or any of those things, then all I'm doing is perpetuating a
Right.
cycle as opposed to breaking a cycle.
Yes. So this would be a good place for you to kind of tell us, just, for the person who, hasn't, well, probably not many people have read it yet, not as many as will because it's not out yet, but give us, like,
Yeah.
sort of a little bit of a primer on what it was like for you and when you started to realize, like, oh, this way that I'm growing up is not normal, and there are a lot of
Yeah.
things that I'm not getting that I need. Like, when did
Mhm.
give us some of the details there.
I think it's really interesting because I would be interested to know your thoughts on this since you were same. I think as a child, I think something has to be really wrong for you to know that what you're growing up in isn't normal. Like, because it's just all you know. And I think as a kid, we're just made where you're so self-focused anyway that you're not looking around going, well, this isn't normal. So I can think about like, I mean, I think for me, the first time was my parents got divorced when I was 8. And I remember thinking, well, now I'm like the kid with divorced parents. And there weren't a lot of other kids with divorced parents at that stage. And so I remember thinking, well, this kind of makes me different. And I remember even then thinking it kind of made me feel like I was less than in some way, like I was a little broken. And so I think that was almost another layer of like when I would go to like friends' houses and I would meet their parents, like I didn't want to be like the broken kid from a divorced home. So there again, I'm always like smiling and people pleasing and look how charming I am and likable and normal, but I always felt like I was an outcast a little bit. And then I think when I got to the teenage years, there was so much with my mom and me. And it's so hard because that mother-daughter relationship can be so combative sometimes anyway. But I don't think it was until I got to college and I think college is the age where you start to look around. You go home with people and you see the way their families interact for the weekend. You start to pay more attention to dynamics and things. I think you're at an age where you're thinking about like that you may meet your person and start a family and all that stuff. So I think to me, like 19, 20, when I was like, this is not normal. Like the constant emotional instability, the never knowing, the volatility, the things that she would say to me, that my mom would say to me, I was like, this I don't think that was normal. Like I mean, I remember having a conversation with somebody and I said something about my mom and I was like, well, my mom was just always like in bed when I left for school. And then she was in bed when I got home. And I remember this person looked at me like, what? And I was like, oh, I thought that's what moms did. I just thought they stayed in bed all day. I didn't like, it was just, so there were things that all of a sudden as a 19, 20-year-old, I was like, this is not right. And my mom got remarried my junior year of college. And I think at that point, it really like, that was a real defining moment in terms of realizing that I was never a priority for her. And that she was always just chasing her own happiness and what she wanted. And from that point on, it felt like things got progressively worse. And so I think it's a combination of being a grown-up. And I think also the more happiness I found or the more independent I became or the more I broke away from that, the more toxic her behavior became towards me.
I was reading, because my daughter is getting married later this year. So I was
Just so exciting.
I was talking to Emmy about it and I was telling her and reading some little parts about your wedding day and just like behavior that like as a mom who's getting ready to be like a mother of the bride, you can't even fathom saying or happening, or when you guys went back and looked at, your wedding picture and she thinks that the way you have your head turned means that you didn't want her there. And I mean, and honestly, I felt like that was even some more of the milder things that she said to you. And what struck me when I was reading your book, which was way different than mine, most of mine was neglect. It wasn't outright meanness. Like it wasn't somebody very often being directly mean to me. And I don't know. My heart was just like breaking. I'm like, I can't imagine somebody that is supposed to love you so much and be your protector just being that mean.
Yeah. I mean, it really, and I think there's something about now, I mean, and so much of it, my eyes weren't opened until I had a daughter of my own. And then when you have your own daughter, I was like, I would never in a million years, no matter what Caroline's did or said or how she messed up, I would never say these things to her. I would never make her feel this way. I would never act this way. It's just, you almost can't wrap your mind around it because it's so contrary to how you would be. And I think the interesting thing is like, I can look back and now with my mom, I do think, and I want to say this, is there were layers of, I think, mental illness and instability. I mean, she was diagnosed bipolar. I think she had borderline personality disorder. I think there were a lot of things that she was fighting there that she medicated. her own demons that she was fighting. And I don't know all the origins of all of those, but I know that they were there. And but in the 80s and 90s, nobody was talking about that. Nobody was talking about your mental
No.
wellness or telling you to go to a therapist or get on medication or any of that stuff. I mean, so I don't think she had access to those things, but I do think that there was something that was just off in
Yeah.
her, that just she didn't have the
Yeah.
capability, because I can't fathom how else you could just be that toxic
Right.
to someone that you're supposed to love. And I think that what is tricky is, when I look at my mom, and I say this in the book, is there were also times, and you've talked about it with your
The
dad, where like
best.
we we would have so much fun together. We would go shop, we would go to Walmart, we would be at the lake house. We would, I mean, I can think of a lot of times where we would laugh and have a great time. And that's what keeps you holding on, because you're like, if you could just equate somebody to everything about them as
Then you can move
terrible,
on. Yeah.
that's it. But when you're in that balance of, but this was so good, like, how can this be this good and then all of a sudden be this
Yeah.
bad? It's just
And let
whiplash.
me ask you this, because this was something that was so interesting with my experience, is that my sister, I had a younger sister too, but I was the
Mm-hmm.
one, because I was the older one. So I was the one who, like, sort of took it upon myself to make things okay, to
Yeah.
sort of in whatever way, like, take care of my dad. Although she did quite a bit of that after I went to medical school, but I assumed that role of, I'm going to somehow make this better. And her
Mm-hmm.
experience of all of it was so different than mine. And as it's interesting because my cousin, when you're in a family of trauma, you have these people that you
Yeah.
experience a lot of the trauma with. And I had a cousin who was like a
Yeah.
sister to me who experienced it. And she's like, listen, I can't wait to write my book because it's going to be way different than yours. You were way too kind. So I'm
Okay.
curious, like, for you, how your sister's experience of it all might have been different, and what's been her reaction to it.
So she's 4 years younger than me. Her experience has been different in a lot of ways, because I think for whatever reason, I talk about my parents getting divorced. I'm very much like my dad. Amy, in a lot of ways, is like our mom, personality wise. So I think that there was always this
Yeah.
clash I think my mom always resented the relationship between my
Yeah.
dad and me. And so I think that created this
It was like
whole
you 2
thing
are
of, and
kind
I
of
think,
enemies. Yeah.
yes, always. Like, and just kind of because I was a daddy's girl, I adored my dad. And I think so there was always this animosity built in there. Whereas my sister was her
Okay.
baby,
So her
and
experience was different.
and
Yeah.
totally different. And I think totally different to a point. But I also think that Amy got to a point as she got older where she experienced a lot of the chaotic behavior. Because what I say is, like, when I was a junior in college and I wasn't living at home, that's when mom got married again. And so Amy had to deal with the upheaval of, our life had just kind of seemed kind of good. And then you chose to marry this man who didn't want to marry somebody with kids, and you've moved me to this new house in this new neighborhood. So I mean, Amy experienced some of the
Yeah.
chaos. I don't think she experienced a lot of the anger
Okay.
until later in life. Now, ironically, I think that once I took myself out of the
Yeah.
picture, I think then Amy did become a target for more of
Okay.
that. But I did. So before I turned this book in, I gave it to my dad and stepmom to read, and I gave it to my sister to read, because I said,
You want everybody's blessing. Yeah.
I want y'all to know, I don't want there to be any surprises. I want everybody to feel like, and Amy said that was hard to read, but it was fair. It was accurate. And that's what I wanted to, because Amy ended up, because I walked away from my relationship with my mom. I mean, the last couple of years of my mom's life, Amy had to take care of
Yeah.
her, and and helped her, and all of that stuff. So Amy stayed involved up until the end. But I think everybody's experience can be so different depending on, I mean, and I think one of the things that I've read, like when you read about like borderline personality disorder, one of the trademarks is that you very much, as the parent, you try to pit the siblings
Against each
against
other.
each other, because you don't want them to unite against you. So there's a good one and a bad
And
one,
you were the
and I
bad
was the
one.
bad one. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Wow.
I was always the one, and it came with so much, like, kind of religious baggage and guilt and all of this stuff of, like, that always made me feel like if I could just be better, if I could
When I
just
read that
be
line
good
of
enough.
you, going like down for the altar call. I'm like, oh, how
Yeah.
many times did I get saved and baptized, hoping this would finally
That's
do the
it.
trick?
Yeah. Yeah. That I thought this would be the thing. It would just make me good enough that I could keep it all, because this is just, she acts like this because I can't give her what she needs, and I
Yeah.
can't be, you know, docile enough or sweet enough or whatever it is she was needing me to be. And then you realize, well, that is not really a child's
No.
job to be that for their mother
And I'm
or their
curious,
father.
like for your dad, because I have always, I mean, I've been seeing, pictures of your whole family. I've seen pictures of your dad. I feel like I know them all in a way. And
Hmm.
he's just adorable. You look just like him. I'm
Yeah.
curious for him how this has been for him. I'm sure it was also hard to read.
I think it was hard to read. It's interesting because he said after he read it, is he said, man, he goes, I feel bad because there was a lot of that I
Right.
didn't know.
My mom my mom's
Just,
reaction was exactly the same because she was doing the
yeah.
best she could, working several jobs, trying to keep
Yep.
us in an apartment, and so then
Hmm.
we would end up staying with my dad's family, which is where all of the stuff took place, and a lot of it she didn't know, and you don't know how to communicate that as a kid, you
No,
know?
no, you're not coming home and saying it because number one, you don't know that it's not
Right.
normal. And number two, you do feel this sense of loyalty. So you're not going to, I mean, my thing was always like, I didn't want to hurt my mom. Like, I didn't want to
Yes.
hurt her. Even when she hurt me, it was like I was always so protective of her because I knew that she was wounded. And, somewhere in me, I knew she was wounded enough that I didn't want to add to
Yeah.
that. And so I told him, I was like, I didn't tell you because number one, I didn't know it was anything to say. And I also think at that time we've laughed. I'm like, what were you going to do about it? I'm like, you're a dad in the 70s. Nobody was giving you
Oh,
custody. I mean, if you even could have figured that out, that wasn't going to
well, and
happen
then,
back
yeah, they
then.
gotta work and yeah, it was just so different.
Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
different time.
Um, it's interesting, um, like, when I read, um I had a similar thing with my dad, like, very protective of him, so, I
Hmm.
could feel this way about it, but I was very, very protective of him and always trying to hope that my next good grade or my next achievement, that's gonna be the thing that inspires him to,
Yeah.
whatever, become a dad and, and
Hmm.
participate. And then you realize like, oh, this is not the way this is ever gonna work. And I think
Yeah.
coming to terms with that takes us, however long it takes us. For me, it took a long time of me kind
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
still having those dysfunctional patterns that I had developed
Yeah.
naturally. I mean, I can understand why, but in response to that. So I'm curious for you because you've mentioned people pleasing. Like, what are some things that you realize, like, oh, as a result of this being the way I was
Hmm.
raised, I developed these patterns? And I'm thinking specifically because it's my 25th wedding anniversary year of the
Oh,
chapter in the
yeah.
book where you're like, Perry and I are, celebrating our 25th together, and
Hmm.
how you realize, like, even in this relationship that you love so much, how you've hidden away parts of yourself, how you've supported
Yeah.
yourself, suppressed your own desires, emotions. What was
Hmm.
that process like for you and for the 2 of you?
I mean, I think it's interesting because it's weird that it all coincides with, because here's the question. Is it 25 years of marriage? Is it healing from generational trauma? Is it that you've hit menopause and you just don't care anymore? You know what I mean?
I
Like,
get
is
it.
it just your hormones and you're like, I'm
I'm
just not as
done.
nice as I used to be.
Yeah.
Like, maybe it's that too. It's like it's a weird combo of like coming into
Yeah.
yourself. And I think Perry and I, even early on in our marriage, I could remember us having fights or having disagreements where he would say to me like, I can't read your mind, because I would get mad because I wanted him to know something about me that I hadn't told him about me, and that there was no way that he could know that if I hadn't
Yes.
voiced that. But I honestly didn't know how to
I
voice
know.
it. Like, I didn't know how to say, I don't like this, or I don't want to do this, or I don't want to go eat here for dinner. I mean, I still kind of default to whatever everybody
Yeah.
wants to do, like,
Yes.
just, it's that whole thing of, um, and Perry is he and Caroline both, they're both, maybe overreactors. They're intense
Yeah.
personalities. So they have these reactions to things that really are not commensurate with whatever is
Yes.
going on, if that
Yes.
makes sense. Like, and I laugh because like Perry's going to get like, if we're in an argument, like a legitimate argument, he's going to be very calm the whole time and just say, hey, I'm sorry you feel that way. Let's talk about this or whatever. If he can't get like a can opener to work, he may throw it down the street. Like it's just,
Yes. And amen. Got one of those too.
yeah. So it's the whole thing of, but I don't know why. Like it dawned on me and I was like, why did it take me this long? Because Perry has never made me not feel safe. He's never made me feel like he was going to walk away. He's never made me feel like he is not in this with me. But I still felt like there was this part of me that couldn't ever say, this is how I really feel about something, or this is what I want, or this is what I care about, from big stuff to stupid
Yes.
stuff. And it was funny because it was our 25th wedding anniversary when we were like, what would you change? And I thought, I wish I had learned earlier that it was okay to say, here is what I need.
Yes.
Here is what I want. Because there's never been one time that I've said that to him where he's been like,
where he
well,
doesn't
sorry.
want to comply, to help you to, yeah.
That's it.
It's interesting too, because in my program, where a lot of times we're doing this work, I'm help because I have come through such a transformation, helping women heal. And we talk about people pleasing being lying. And I loved this line in your book where you said, I still find myself in whatever way lying, people pleasing, it's the same thing. Because that's just, I'll just be who you need me to be. I'll do what you need me to do. And it's interesting because I have been the same way, and trying to even become a person who really is in touch enough with myself to know what I want.
That's part of it too, is sometimes it's like if somebody gives me and they're like, what do you want? I'm like, I don't know what I want. I'm not used to being able to think about what I want. Like it was always just about what
need to do,
was going to keep everybody,
to want, or need to be, to keep the peace, or to.
That's it. And just to be able to say, and I think part of my whole growth process, ironically, was watching Caroline, who is so much like her dad, where, from the time she was little, like she would walk in, she knew exactly how to advocate for herself. She knew to say what she wanted, how she wanted it, whatever. She's never been afraid to voice an opinion or to advocate for herself. And I was like, well, what is that like? Like that, how do you know to do that?
Yes.
Because I was like, I'm a grown woman and I don't know how to do that. And part of it is I think when you've grown up in a way where everything that I really wanted, anytime I did speak out or say, I don't like this or whatever, it was immediately cast aside. Like it was immediately discounted, or it was made to be where it was, I can remember saying something like, this made me feel, or this was really hard. And my mom would always be like, oh, poor Melanie, your life is so hard, and so you just feel like, oh, I don't have the right to say, yeah, so I'm just going to keep it quiet. And so I think in my marriage, and Perry would say, because now we've been married 28 years, for better or for worse, I've really found my voice here over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And so, but it was a learning process, because I think when you've grown up a certain way, there's certain behaviors that are so ingrained in you, you don't even realize that they're there.
One of the things for me was that I learned early on that if there's conflict, it's not going to end well. Somebody's going to go to jail. Something's going to get broken. It's not going to go well. So I just learned to avoid conflict at all costs. Well, when you're in a marriage, it's built on healthy conflict sometimes, right? And I was so afraid of that if Stevie would bring up anything that might be a conflict, in my mind, I would go, well, I guess is he going to leave? Does he want a divorce? Like what, so I would catastrophize everything. And he finally said, this was probably 10 or 15 years ago. He's like, we can't even have a disagreement. We can't even have like a healthy fight, because you make that mean that, and it was such an eye opener for me. And I told him, I said, if you will be patient with me, I will get to the bottom of this. I want to heal this. I realize that this is not something you're doing. This is something that I'm bringing. This is like an internalized trauma that sets off an alarm in my body that I almost can't help. But I really wanted to, I wanted to learn how to get healthy so that we could have a disagreement, so that I could have I remember the first year, I think it was the year I was turning 51. I mean, it's just been like 4 or 5 years ago. But I remember thinking to
Yeah.
myself, because forever I had been like, for instance, for my birthday, "Well, I don't know, whatever, we don't have to do
Mhm.
anything," and then I would be secretly resentful that he didn't plan something that I wanted to do, and I
Yeah. Yeah.
remember, like, getting healthy enough to go, "Look, I'm responsible for my life, for my emotions, I'm responsible for my birthday, I know what I want," and I told him,
Yeah.
I said, "Look, it's on my bucket list to go. I wanna go out west and hike on my birthday. I wanna go to Zion." I told him the exact spot I
Mhm.
wanna hike to, and I said, "So I'm going on January 4th, and I would love for you to go. It would be so fun, but you don't have to if you don't want to."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Of course I wanna go."
Mhm.
Instead of,
Yeah.
like, not saying that or kind of and
And
he'd
then
be
being mad
mad or
where you're like,
resentful
"How dare you? How dare you not take me out hiking
on my
on my
birthday.
birthday?"
And
Yeah.
it's hilarious because over the years, I've kind of gotten to be known for someone who's like, "No, take control of your own birthday. You know what you want."
Yeah.
And this year, my kids surprised me with a surprise party. I've never had one in my life. And
Which
it
I
was
loved. Yes, I thought it
insane
was so
because
cute.
they were like,
Mhm.
"Of course she doesn't expect it because she's taking charge of her birthday." And I do think that those
Yeah.
kind of things that we bring into our marriage and we bring into our own family life, it's so worth the effort to confront the dragons, to heal it. It's not gonna kill you, it's gonna make you stronger, and
That's it.
whether you confront it or not, it's lurking there, it's having its effect. It is
Yep.
probably doing some things in your own parenting or in your own marriage that aren't great. So I would love for
Yeah.
you to speak to this because I think sometimes, what I do, coaching, which is a lot like counseling in a way, or counseling
Mhm.
for women like us who grew up in the '70s, who raised ourselves, this is
Yeah.
hard for us. It's hard for us to need
Uh-huh.
help, to accept help. So tell me about that. What was that journey like for you, knowing like, okay, I think I need to get some help with this?
Yeah. It was, it was funny because I've always been somebody who was like, people go to therapy. That's a millennial thing. I don't need therapy.
I got this.
Whatever, yeah, rub some dirt on it. You're fine. Like that was kind of always my mentality. Like I didn't really understand it. I was like, what good does it do to go like talk to somebody? Like I can talk to people and I've got great girlfriends that I can talk. And, we always say we're each other's free
Yeah.
therapist, so but I think for me, it was when I finished writing this book and then just life kind of, Caroline was going through some hard things and I was fully kicked into menopause. And so I think I was dealing with some anxiety. I think at that point, I was having this vulnerability hangover of, have I really written this book? Like, am I really doing this? And so I was just processing through a lot, the grief of my mom and just what that looked like. And it just all kind of came to the surface. And so I'd had a close girlfriend, a younger girl who'd been in a Bible study I was doing. And she had mentioned at lunch, she was like, "Oh, I'm seeing the best therapist and she's really helped me. And she's this amazing Christian woman." And so I was like, "Oh, that's good for you. What a great journey for you." And about 3 weeks later, I felt like the bottom fell out and I just couldn't, I felt like I was almost having panic attacks. Um, and so I texted her and I said, "Hey, I need the name of your therapist." And so she referred me to her and she has just been a godsend. Like it was just, there's something so helpful because I think the difference and I wouldn't have known this before, when you talk to your girlfriends, when you talk to your husband, when you talk to whoever, they're coming at it from kind of your
Yeah.
perspective. And I kind of would have this thing of, well, of course they agree with me because they love me and I'm telling them my side and whatever. I think to sit with somebody who is an unbiased professional and say, here are some things that I've been through, and this is the way that they have looked. And for somebody to kind of validate and say, no, that was
Yes.
traumatic. That was hard. That was not the way that should have been. This created in you, like you just need somebody to walk you
Yes.
through it. And so that's been so healing for me. And from a biblical perspective, I mean, I think as a Christian, that's so important is to have somebody who is like, okay, where do you need God to come in and heal this? Because it's healing that only He can
Yeah.
bring. And then where are some ways that you can change patterns of thinking or kind of rewire your brain to go to this place instead of this place. And so I highly recommend it. I had never been like a huge proponent, but I think if you can find somebody good, I just think there's something about that unbiased third party to talk to who knows how to
Yeah,
equip
it's
you.
kind of like I think about it with a hero's journey. It's kind of like it's your Gandalf that
Yes,
equips you to
yes.
go, no, we can fight these dragons. This is not going to take us down. Like somebody to kind of go with you as you
Yep.
look at what's lurking under those waters or what's lurking behind there.
Yep.
And it's so interesting to me now because I feel like I'm 10 years now kind of past. I remember when I walked out of my therapist's office, the only thing that I said during that, she said to me, "Are you angry with your dad?" And she was doing
Mm,
some muscle testing on me, so she was basically asking my body. And it's
mm,
that kind of therapy is kind of interesting because it's a little different than talk therapy because what I said with my mouth was no, but my
yeah.
body answered yes, and as soon as I caught myself trying to lie to make everything okay,
Mhm.
the bottom
Yeah.
fell out. I'm like,
Yep.
"Oh, I
Yep.
am angry."
Yeah.
And God can
Yeah.
hold that. Like, I should
Uh-huh.
be angry, and
Yeah.
that's okay, and
And
we
it's
can heal
okay.
from that. Yeah, but until you can admit it, until you can say,
That's it.
and so I think it's finding that safe space where you can kind of say the thing that you haven't
Yep.
been able to say. I didn't know I was trying to cover for it or lie
That's it.
about it or whatever. I was
Mhm.
just doing the best I
Yep.
could to survive. So I do think there's so
Yeah.
much value in doing that. I also think that a book like this can be that mentor that kind of helps you go, "Oh, this is worth confronting. This is worth, you
Yeah.
know, giving some time and attention to." And I'm just so thankful. I know this wasn't easy. The other thing that I love so much about you is how much humor you infuse into it.
Well,
So
because listen, you know the benefit of a childhood like ours, it gives you a
you're
dark sense
so
of humor.
funny.
That's it.
I know. And it's funny because in my circle, my cousin was the funny one. But listen, she wouldn't have
Mhm.
been nearly as funny if I wouldn't have been there laughing the whole time. So it takes
Yeah.
both kinds. And you would be like,
That's right.
I mean, I wish I had bookmarked one of those places where the whole thing was so serious and then you introduce something like, okay, well, back to the skincare for my face, but let's
Yeah.
talk about that for a minute. Like the way you weave in humor in the way you write and the way you think and talk, because you're like that in real life, it's so funny. And it adds this sort of like lighthearted element to it. And I think it was a coping mechanism for us because
Yeah.
if you didn't laugh, it was going to take you under.
That's it.
So I do.
Mhm.
Do you feel like
Mhm.
that with your humor because you're so funny? But do you feel like part of that I mean, it's a gift that came from this
Oh,
place.
yeah. I totally believe that, like, if you'll let it, like, I think the hard stuff you go through, like, I mean, I just laughter and humor has always been probably a coping mechanism for me in a way. I mean, I've just always like, I can't stay in that heavy place. Like, I've got to come
Yep.
up for
Yep.
air. Like, I've got to come up for air. And then I'll go right back down with you, but I've got to come up for air and laugh at either the absurdity of it or the darkness of it. And it's funny because even Caroline will say, she was talking to somebody the other day and she said something about like dealing with like mean girls in high school. And somebody was like, "You dealt with that in high school?" Or like, "You went through that?" And she was like, "Why do you think I'm funny?" Like, and I was like,
Yeah.
that's it. It gives you this like,
Yes.
it just gives you a good
It
sense of
does
humor.
give you a
So
good sense of humor. Of course, I also think the
yeah.
time that we were raised, which was basically exactly, the same time, that time in
Yeah.
history, that time of it was just there was nothing quite like it. Like the stuff our parents did, the stuff that we grew up doing
Oh,
was crazy.
it was it was Sophie and I were talking about that this week because we went on this deep dive of like music like in the 70s and 80s, which I know you love, and country music. And she said, "Can we talk about the song Somebody's Knocking by Terry Gibb?" Like the fact that we all belted that out is like 9-year-olds. Like my fever's burning, so we ought to feel right at home. Like, Lord, it's the devil. And we just sang it in the back of those station wagons while our parents were smoking their cigarettes, and we're just as
As could
happy,
be.
just
Well,
as It's
It's so
carefree.
funny because one of the things when I got toward the end of the book, I mean, I literally there were so many places where I just couldn't put it down. It's so good. So well written.
Thank you,
I
Edie.
mean, just that the way you kind of weave back and forth too between, your story and Caroline's story, so good. But when I got to the part where your mom's last words to you, I
Yeah.
died because I could belt out at full voice every single word to Garth Brooks Rodeo, every single word. Also, ain't coming down till the sun goes up.
The
Yeah,
sun comes
whatever that
up.
one was,
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
that's the best thing I've heard in so long. I can't tell you.
But here's the thing though too, and this is why like I'm like you, I love a memoir because real life
It's
is
so
so
much
much better than
funnier and
anything you
better.
could even make up.
I know. It is so good.
Because even when that happened in that moment, like my sister and I got in the car and she was like, Mom really just say what I thought she said? And I was like, yeah, that's it. That was it.
So good. So good.
What are you
What are
gonna
you gonna
do?
do?
Life is funny. Life is funny.
Well, and yeah,
So
just the way you kind of weave that in. I feel like in some ways we were like separated at birth. I feel like just I don't know. There's so many things in here where I'm like, Melanie and I need more FaceTime together because we need to talk about
yeah, we do.
this and we need to talk about this and we need to talk about skincare and we just got so many things to catch up on.
All the things. All the things. I know. I can't wait. We've got to
Well,
make
I
it
want to
happen.
tell everybody, I know I've kept you for a long time. I want to tell everybody that
No, you're so
when
good.
this podcast comes out, we are going to be 3 or 4 days, probably maybe 4 days from the book coming out. And I went this morning and you had already sent me the book, but I went and pre-ordered it because I know what that means
Listen,
to
what a
an author.
friend.
That is a friend who loves you, but I want everybody else to go do that because first of all, you get the first 3 chapters and you need to get the first 3 chapters read so that when you pre-order this book and it comes in the mail the week of whatever, February 20th or whatever that week is that it's coming out,
Yeah.
you'll be ready to start in on chapter 4. And there's a podcast in there which was so good with you and Sophie and Caroline. So I listened to that. Like I just have never been so happy to pre-order a book and get
Thank you,
the little
friend.
goodies that come with it. So I just want to encourage everybody to do that. It helps other people. It helps other people find the book. It helps the book. A book is like putting your baby out in the world. It's like birthing something,
It is.
that's amazing. And we like to give it a good start. And the pre-orders really help. So I just want to encourage all my people to go pre-order. We'll
Thank
put the
you.
links to do that down in the show notes. And I just want to say thank you so much for being brave enough to do this. When I know how it feels to write a book like this, and mine about killed me dead. And the
Yeah.
work that it
Yeah.
took, the inner work that it took, the bravery, the
Mhm.
time, the courage, the tears, the belly laughs, I'm sure, when you would recall something that was really funny.
Yes.
Like I just know what it takes, and it's not for the faint of heart. And I'm so thankful that God made you and that He gave you the gifts that He gave you, that He gave you such a beautiful family to support you. I'm so proud of you and Perry and how you've raised Caroline. I can't wait for her book. Just
I
so
know.
proud of her. When I was listening to her in the podcast, I'm like, this is what it looks like to break a generational curse. I can hear it in her
Right.
voice. Like you can just hear
Mhm.
just the freedom and the courage that she has
Yeah.
from watching you
Yeah.
live your life, mother
Uh-huh.
her, confront your own demons, be brave enough to put this out in the world. And I just couldn't be prouder of you. So thankful for you. So thankful that God brought us
No.
together back in
Me too. Me
1859,
too.
whenever we met on this
When the internet
when the
began,
internet began. My
well,
daughter
I feel the same way. I love watching you and your beautiful family and you listen, your grandmother goals is what I'm going to say because you're just listen, you're out there doing your CrossFit and you got your grandbabies and the whole thing and you're helping us all. You're showing us how to do this stage of life well and how to
oh,
come show up with our whole full selves. And so I just adore you and I can't thank you enough for having me
oh,
on.
thank you so much. We love you so much and we support you. Anything that we can
Love
do.
you.
Love you to death. Yay for this book. Everybody go out and get Here Be Dragons, and just so grateful. So thank you so much.
Thank you, friend.